Good morning, everyone. We're now going to close the polls and are ready to start the webinar. I'm Jan Ivey, Chief Specialist of Watershed Plans and Source Water Protection for Credit Valley Conservation and also the Chair of the Latornell Steering Committee. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on nature-based solutions for a changing climate. We're gathered together in this virtual space from many areas. I'm speaking to you from Guelph, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Guelph is situated on treaty lands that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Today, I acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples from whose traditional territory I'm speaking to you. I would also like to acknowledge that you're joining us from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. The success of last year's Latornell Leadership Project webinar series really showed us that despite, or maybe because of our limited opportunities to network face-to-face, as a community of practice, we still need a space to meet to share our accomplishments, our innovations, our lessons learned as we work to protect the environment. And I hope that today's webinar fills some of that gap for you. This webinar is the 6th and final in our Conservation Matters series. Over the fall of this year, we brought you sessions on watershed management, ecological offsetting, ecological monitoring tools, conservation areas programming, and Indigenous-led conservation movements. If you've missed any of the webinars that we held earlier this fall or the series from last year, you can find recordings on the Latornell website. Now, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's session. Scott Peck is the Deputy CAO and Director of Watershed Planning and Engineering with the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Scott has 30 years of experience working first for the Long Point Region CA as an Assistant Resource Technician, and then Hamilton Conservation Authority as an Environmental Planner and Senior Planner, and then Norfolk County with as a Senior Planner. Scott's experience includes policy development, program management, urban, rural, and agricultural land use planning, floodplain management, environmental and watershed planning, property acquisition, and regulatory compliance and sustainable development, a true master of many fields. Scott has a BA degree in geography from Wilfrid Laurier and a diploma in public administration from the University of Western Ontario. Scott's also a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and is a registered professional planner. Scott, welcome as the moderator. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Jan. I appreciate that. Thanks for the opening remarks and the introduction. Good morning, everyone. We have an awesome turnout today. We have over 300 people registered for today's webinar. As Jan said, my name is Scott Peck, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this nature-based solutions for our changing climate webinar. We're proud of the ways the Latornell Conservation Symposium has brought us together over the past 26 years and are looking forward to reconvening in 2022. We want to continue to bring Ontario conservationists together to talk about the big issues and develop the collaborations that we need in order to find solutions. So if you haven't already, keep in touch with us by signing up on the newsletter at latornell.ca. And thank you for joining us for this Conservation Matters series of webinars. The format of the webinar today is in two main parts. The first session will have 3 presentations, followed by a second set with one presentation. This will be followed by a Q&A session, a panel discussion consisting of questions from you, our audience, through your questions submitted in the Q&A box that we have. We will do our best to cover as many of your questions as possible, and you can also help by clicking upvoting your questions that are of interest to multiple people. A few housekeeping items for you this morning. First of all, our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or turn on your video. As I've said, you've been able to find your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Use that to ask your questions and to upvote your questions as you can. If you'd like to ask the speaker a question, please type that into the box and we'll take a look at it. And again, if you would like to include which speaker you'd like to address, that would be helpful as well. you can upvote your question you like by pressing the thumbs up button. So feel free to interact with others in the webinar as well through the chat box. To our speakers, a reminder to use your mute button when you are not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. This webinar is being recorded so that anyone who is not able to attend will be able to listen at their leisure. So with that, before I introduce our speakers, I would like Mario to bring up our poll results right now. We had a condensed poll this time, and you can just see that where our participants are from across Ontario, as well as the representation from CAs, municipalities, non-government organizations, and provincial and federal ministries. So thanks very much, everybody, for answering our polls. And I would like just to move into the first part of our webinar and the presentation of our speakers. Their presentation is called Natural Asset Management in the Grindstone Creek Watershed, and they will be discussing a new project and is the first watershed-wide natural assets management project in Ontario involving MNAI, Conservation Halton, the cities of Burlington and Hamilton, RBG, the Greenbelt Foundation. Grindstone Creek Watershed involves natural assets inventory, technical assessments with climate change lens, carbon storage and stormwater services, and incorporation into asset management plans. We have three speakers today, Chitra Gowda, Roy Brook, and Cary Clark. And I'll just go through their bios quickly. Cary Clark is the Manager of Development of Stormwater Engineering with the City of Burlington. Cary graduated from Queen's University with a civil engineering degree in 1983. He is a licensed professional engineer in the province of Ontario. His current position is Manager of Development and Stormwater Engineering in the Engineering Services Department at the City of Burlington. His duties include managing the development approvals process and the Stormwater Capital Program. Prior to working for the City of Burlington, Cary managed the land development and aggregate license rehabilitation programs for a private company in Niagara. He has also worked in the consulting engineering field on land development and municipal engineering design projects in various locations across Southern Ontario. Roy Brook is Executive Director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. He served as Director of Sustainability for the City of Victoria between 2011 and 2013. Between 2003 and 2011, he worked for the United Nations, including the World Health Organization, United Nations Environment Program, and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. During his time with the UN, he was based in Geneva, Switzerland, and later in Rwanda, where he was the UNEP's Environmental Program Coordinator. Prior to this, he served as a political advisor to Canada's Environment Ministry. Lastly, Chitra Gowda is the Senior Manager, Watershed Planning Services and Source Protection with Conservation Halton. Her experience includes strategic planning, multi-stakeholder collaborations, and policy development. Her work over 2 decades involves collaborative watershed management, including watershed science and monitoring, source water protection, watershed planning, climate change assessments, Great Lakes health, and more. She holds a bachelor and a master's degree in environmental engineering. Chitra has worked with public and private sectors, Indigenous peoples, and all levels of government. In 2020, she was awarded the Water's Next Leader Award for significant contributions to the Canadian water industry. Chitra is a certified environmental professional. Welcome to our presenters, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. We'll just get our slides going. So thank you very much. Really delighted to be here representing the 2% of folks who are from outside Ontario. As Scott said, my name is Roy Brook. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to introduce this Grindstone Creek Watershed project and the new approach to natural assets management that it represents. And I hope you will agree that it's an interesting and exciting possibility to expand the relevance and appeal of watershed management beyond traditional conservation audiences to include some more unusual suspects. I will provide some initial context, a bit of an exploration of natural asset management. Then I will turn it over to Cary to provide Burlington's perspective, and then finally to Chitra to speak from Conservation Halton's perspective in this project. And I should say that I'm calling in from Victoria, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen people. Next slide, please. So most of you will already be extremely familiar with nature-based solutions, but I thought I would just take 2 minutes or so to provide some context on the links between ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, and natural assets, and why we care about these in urban context before diving more specifically into natural assets management. Just as a brief recap on ecosystem services, these are regulating services, provisioning services, supporting services, for example, things like soil formation, and then cultural ones like ecotourism or spiritual ones. They enable all of our life and basically all human activity. Next slide, please. So within this context, nature-based solutions are considered to be actions to actually protect or enhance or secure our ability to receive these ecosystem services. So obviously a very sort of human-centric approach. Now, nature-based solutions, it's a very broad category, and as this slide from Green Infrastructure Ontario suggests, it could include consideration of traditional, what we would traditionally think of natural assets such as wetlands, forests, riparian areas, more enhanced natural assets like rain gardens and so on, all the way through to more traditional, or to what we think of maybe as the more engineered end of things like permeable pavers, green roofs, and so on. And nature-based solutions can also include a wide variety of frameworks through which we can take action to secure nature-based solutions or ecosystem services. These range from things like low impact development, green shores, and what I'll be speaking of, which is natural asset management. And there's further sort of subdivisions in here. Some nature-based solutions are more infrastructure oriented, and some are less infrastructure oriented, like traditional conservation or rewilding or sustainable agriculture. So all of this to say that that nature-based solutions is quite a broad field, and that what Cary and Chitra and I are speaking about is one subset of this field called natural assets management. But before I dive into the specifics of that, I have one more context slide here. If you could please advance one slide. We can think about nature-based solutions really at any scale, but it's at the local level that I believe they're most acute. It's where we feel nature's benefits the most and where the most people benefit from them, but it's also where they are the most vulnerable, and also where our actions can have the most direct and immediate impact. I'd also invite you to think of the challenge of scale. Now, more than ever, we need the tools and the ability to protect nature, biodiversity, ecosystem services, really at scale. However, most recently, the OECD last year, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, really noted that a lot of nature-based solutions remain stuck at either kind of a theoretical or academic level, or at the level of pilot projects. So not at scale, not at a level commensurate with the challenges. And so we really need approaches that are fundamentally or inherently scalable. And I hope as you listen to this presentation, you'll see the promise for natural asset management to be that one scalable approach. A third and final challenge with nature-based solutions, or something we need to be very mindful of, is that they must always be rooted in the idea of restoring, enhancing nature, biodiversity, its connectivity, and never be about just stepping on nature harder to extract more services from it. And that, in the project that we're going to be describing, is something we've paid quite a bit of attention to. So next slide, please. Diving more specifically into natural asset management. So what do we mean by natural assets? These are defined as the stocks of natural resources or ecosystems that local governments can or do rely on for the provision of one or more core local government services. And so if you forget everything else that I'm going to say, I just say, remember the following: natural assets such as wetlands, forests, green spaces, riparian areas, they're amongst our most valuable ones, and they can be central to any infrastructure system that is resilient. And by understanding them and conceptualizing them as such, local governments can deliver vital services that they would otherwise need to provide via engineered assets, and can sometimes receive a lot of cost savings, and in any scenario will receive a lot of co-benefits. So that's quite a mouthful, so I'll unpack it a bit in the next slide, please. So just to take an example, a wetland, its biological function might be to store water, but that can translate into services for a local government, such as drinking water filtration. It might help to reduce flood risk. However, to the extent that most local governments in Canada are thinking about natural assets at all, they're typically thinking about them fairly narrowly as green or social or recreational amenities. And these are all extremely important, but they predispose us to thinking about sort of pretty and charismatic natural assets, while ones that may be less charismatic, a quote unquote ugly bit of marsh beside the high side of a highway, it might not be beautiful to look at, but it might be providing vital services, whether or not we recognize it. And there's a couple of results to this. Paramount amongst these is that in most local government contexts, nature is overused and under-recognized. And that slide, or that picture you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, is a bit of a metaphor for that, just a bioswale filling up with garbage. And in the picture on the left, at the bottom, what you can see is, this is taken in Gibsons, BC, and you can really sort of trying to illustrate the idea that natural assets can be managed very deliberately to preserve their underlying health and a suite of services that they provide to local governments. Nevertheless, we currently have in Canada a gap between the potential of natural assets and the way in which most local governments are acting on this. Next slide, please. Why do we care about the gap? Well, it depends a bit on one's perspective, but speaking just from a local government perspective, they're responsible for managing about 60% of the country's infrastructure. They only collect about 10 cents on the tax dollar. Most of the existing built stock in this country is aging, maintenance has been deferred, and it is in need of repair. So stated differently, local governments need new ways to think about service delivery. Next slide, please. and as we've seen altogether too frequently, the status quo simply isn't delivering, and that is not. And so local governments can't simply build their way out of this challenge through engineered solutions alone. I'm in BC, as I say, and this is our third state of emergency this year. One from COVID, one from forest fires, and one most recently from the floods that have devastated the province. And all of which to say we need new ways to think about how we deliver services in a changing climate. So what all this really means is that if we have natural assets that can provide core local government services, potentially at a lower cost than their engineered alternatives, this is every single day something that is more and more important for us to consider, to take seriously, and an opportunity for us to figure out how to address. Next slide, please. So the good news in all of this, and what's really made the work of MNAI, which is a national not-for-profit, possible, is the fact that in Canada, local governments, whether they like it, whether they don't like it, they must adopt modern structured asset management processes. And these have as their central organizing principle the idea of sustainable service delivery. This means that if I'm the director of engineering or finance or public works, I don't care so much whether it's a green asset, quote unquote, or a gray asset that's delivering my services, only whether or not that service is cost effective and reliable. And increasingly, we are seeing solid evidence, as Chitra and Cary will be describing, and as I can also allude to, evidence that natural assets are precisely the kinds of assets that can deliver cost-effective and reliable services to local governments, in addition to a wide range of co-benefits. Furthermore, what it really means is that when we approach a local government, we're not having to sort of bend ourselves into a pretzel. When I was director of sustainability for the city of Victoria, I had a quote unquote green agenda, which means that I was constantly having to contort myself to explain how my supposed green agenda fit into everybody else's business. And that was a tough proposition, but really with natural asset management, we're no longer doing that. We are explaining and conceptualizing nature as something that everyone must care about, because we are able to explain it in terms of the core services that it provides. So this makes it, moves it sort of from the periphery of local government decision-making to the center. And we are beginning to find that natural asset management is a useful, valuable, practical tool for managing natural assets. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dive into too much detail here because we really want to focus on the Grindstone Creek example, but I will say that there's a growing number of communities that are working in this space. 5 years ago, there was one community, the town of Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, that was really starting to think about natural asset management in the sense of kind of winding together asset management, ecosystem services, ecological accounting. I don't have time to go into detail, but suffice it to say they remain, I believe, one of the foremost leaders in this country in this space. And they've made really exciting changes at everything from strategy to human resources, operational, financial changes right across the board. By the end of this year, MNAI alone will have worked with close to 100 local governments, including the ones in Grindstone Creek. Just to throw out a couple of very brief examples of the sort of results we've seen from much earlier projects. In Grand Forks, in the central of BC, they had back-to-back flooding emergencies. Together with the city and others, we looked at the role of the floodplain. There was a couple of different options related to the flooding there, and they opted to move away from the traditional berms and dikes. They secured around $54 million from the Federal Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and are really now rebuilding the floodplain to bring it back to its original functions. It will certainly have conservation benefits, but they are also doing this as just a mainstream way to deliver services. The other example I'll quickly mention from Riverview in New Brunswick was that the community there, they had a new development and they had a wetland, and they were going to build a road through the wetland. They didn't really know what the role of the wetland might have been in the development situation. We ran through the whole natural asset management process, which, as I showed on that slide, involves inventorying, modeling, understanding the value of services if they were to be provided by another means. To make a very long story short, they figured out that with us that wetland provided, in the event of a 1 in 100 year storm, which is to say the ones we had a couple of weeks ago in BC, services that were worth around $2.5 million in terms of flood protection if you had to deliver them by another means. So cutting to the chase, they have moved the road. It no longer cuts through the wetland. The wetlands will be preserved. And they're baking this into bylaws and so on in the next year. And I think what this example also really illustrates is that, day by day, hour by hour, local governments are taking land use planning and other decisions across this country that affect natural assets and nature. And if in those decisions you do not understand nature and you do not understand its value, you're still putting a value on nature. It just happens to be zero. And you're taking decisions that are only semi-informed. So I won't have time to go into any more detail on examples. And anyway, we'll get into the heart of it with Grindstone. But just sort of moving towards the next slide, I wanted to emphasize here that on the one hand, it's good news that we've worked in roughly 100 local governments across Canada, in addition, of course, to the wonderful efforts being done by many other players who have nothing to do with M&AI. But there's 3,600 local governments in Canada. And at our current clip, that would take us 50, 75 years to work our way through the country. And it's just not possible. And it's just not fast enough given the scale of the biodiversity and ecosystem health and connectivity challenges we have. So M&AI, amongst others, is working at a kind of enabling level to help natural asset management become broadly based across Canada. Just as throw out a couple of examples, working with the Public Sector Accounting Board to help remove the prohibition against natural assets being considered tangible capital assets for accounting principles. We will need those people that work with local governments to have the requisite kind of tools and knowledge to understand nature as a vital asset. The engineering sector in BC has made a first move and released professional practice guidelines that basically say, look, if you're an engineering registrant in BC and you want to keep your license and you're doing asset management, now you need to think about nature. We hope to extend that to other professions, other provinces. For part of our work, which relates to inventories, we've just launched a project to develop CSA Group, or Canada Standards Association, national standards, so that if someone is doing this work in Gander or Grindstone or anywhere else, they all mean the same thing, so that we're doing things in comparable, replicable ways, and that will help, amongst other things, attract funding. So I'm going to stop there with that introduction and turn it over now to Cary.
Thanks, Roy. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, Roy, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. First, I'd like to provide some comments on the importance of our partnerships. Next slide, please. The partnerships form a fundamental part of this project. Each partner has a key role, and we're very thankful for the great team that was assembled. The Municipal Natural Assets Initiative has provided the organization framework and the guidance. The City of Hamilton and Burlington have provided their asset management data, climate change approaches, and local knowledge. Conservation Halton has provided natural-based solutions and natural asset management through their watershed management programs and also local knowledge. Royal Botanical Gardens has contributed natural assets data and their local knowledge. Academia, NGOs, and various consultants have all contributed with their expertise. Also, having political support is very important. Speaking on behalf of the City of Burlington, we're very fortunate to have Mayor Mead Ward in support of this initiative. In fact, she was instrumental in starting us on the road to initiating this partnership project. Next slide, please. Now, this slide outlines the 4 steps that were followed. Collecting the natural asset inventory data through the collaboration of Conservation Halton, Royal Botanical Gardens, Hamilton, and Burlington. The natural asset inventory was assembled by M&I, and an interactive dashboard was created. Natural assets, conditions, and risk assessment methods were also established by M&AI and Conservation Halton, with assessment contributions provided by all partners. The level of service methodology was provided by the M&AI. Model scenarios were decided upon by the team, and the actual modeling carried out by M&I. The outcome being current and future core service levels for stormwater management, including consideration of climate change impacts. And finally, it's the valuation of the natural assets. M&AI's past experience was invaluable. All partners contributed to providing data to establish asset replacement costs, operation and maintenance costs, and also it was very important to have the product contributions of the natural assets. Next slide, please. I'm going to provide an overview on our current and future approaches from the City of Burlington and how the city will be transitioning to a natural assets approach. Historically, asset management is considered only hard or engineered assets. It's a very typical current municipal approach. Our recent 2021 asset management plan update includes $5.2 billion of assets. They include transportation, stormwater facilities, and buildings, urban forests, parks, transit, fire, and computer side of things. Natural assets included in the plan currently are limited to the urban forest, being the street trees and park trees. Next slide, please. Stormwater assets include storm sewers, inlet outlet structures, culverts, stormwater management ponds, and creek erosion protection works, all engineered assets. Replacement costs of approximately $1 billion. Capital Creek construction projects, which I'm directly involved in, includes replacing or installing new erosion protection with armor stone, riprap, or natural channel designs. The impacts to trees and vegetation does typically occur, and stormwater natural assets are not included in our current asset management plan. Next slide, please. And with respect to our creek reconstruction projects, historically the approach to managing our creeks was to repair creek bank erosion that was a public safety issue or where it could potentially cause damage to private property, buildings, or city infrastructure. Again, engineered assets being constructed. Following a large storm that we had on August 4th, 2014, which incidentally was about 190 millimeters of rain in 8 hours, the city started to implement a flood mitigation and risk reduction approach in addition to erosion protection. When trees are removed as part of the reconstruction, the city's policy is to replace each removed tree with 3 smaller nursery stock trees. In addition, natural vegetation is planted for restoration. This is really the limit of our natural assets approach when it comes to creek reconstruction works. With respect to climate change adaptation, one of our more significant accomplishments recently was last year, our city council approved a comprehensive update to our city's stormwater management design standards. It has an increased focus on development with respect to pre-development versus post-development control of peak flows. We assess global climate change models along with our rainfall data sets. The result was a 15% increase in intensity, duration, frequency curves, which make up our design data, our criteria data. Also, low impact design concepts and green infrastructure are encouraged in all new developments and new city facilities. These are really initial steps to set us up for the inclusion of natural assets into our asset management plan. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the urban forest has started to include natural assets into our asset management plan. And also, as I mentioned, urban forest assets include street and park trees. This replacement costs approximately $300 million. It does not include trees in urban and rural woodlots or creek blocks, which is really a significant part of our tree inventory. Our current and future initiatives include the Urban Forest Management Plan, which is just being started right now. That includes a woodlot management strategy and also collecting natural asset data. Recognition that trees provide a wide range of environmental, economic, and social benefits. And also is a recognition that trees can be seriously impacted by climate change through extreme heat, drought, extreme storms, or invasive species. It's very important that this be aligned with our city's asset management plan. Next slide, please. Now, what our plans are for incorporating natural assets in the future is the first step is this project. And this project has provided the city with a blueprint for how to proceed with assessing the rest of our city watersheds beyond Grindstone Creek and establishing the importance of natural assets. I can't emphasize how important this project has been for the city of Burlington to set us on a path to accomplishing this for the entire city. Burlington's future plan is to give equal consideration to both engineered and natural assets. As I mentioned, forestry has already initiated the beginning stages of the natural assets data inventory. And we also are in the process of implementing a new enterprise asset management solutions model, which provides modern technology, including powerful asset management and planning software to help manage natural assets. Next slide. So in the next 5 years, our asset management update cycle, the city plans to develop a process that guides the addition of natural assets data and inventories for woodlots and creek blocks in both urban and rural areas. Also develop low impact development facilities and green infrastructure. Assessing climate change vulnerability and how natural assets can assist with that adaptation. Create a citywide valuation approach for all of our natural assets, and to review the possibility of including natural assets into our development charges bylaw. Realistically, within 10 years, the city should be in a position to complete the citywide natural assets data collection and inventories, and add these natural assets to our asset management plan. That concludes my presentation. And now I'd like to pass it over to Chicha for Conservation Halton's watershed perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy and Cary, for setting up the preamble and taking a deep dive into the value of incorporating natural assets into our planning processes by Roy, and the bigger picture there, and some of the details, of course, of the values and benefits, and Roy with the municipal perspective and what that brings for municipalities. I'm going to continue the presentation by providing the Conservation Halton perspective as well. So just a little bit about Conservation Halton. We are one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario. We are a watershed management agency. And I'm sure everyone knows, but just as a recap, a watershed is simply an area of land where all of the water that falls on it through rainfall or snowmelt or so on, it drains into the same body of water. And in our case here with Conservation Halton, that is Lake Ontario. We use an integrated watershed management approach to manage human activities and natural resources sustainably together on a watershed basis. And this allows us to consider multiple factors, whether that's social, economic, or environmental interests. And again, that helps us to ensure the sustainable management of natural resources. So here at Conservation Halton, we provide local programs, and that helps meet the local needs. So moving into watershed climate actions for resiliency and how this ties in with the concept of natural asset management. We're doing some estimations of carbon stored and sequestered by natural assets. We'll look at these by the overall Conservation Halton watershed, by the sub-watersheds, including Grindstone Creek, and also by municipal boundaries. So we'll be looking at the carbon removal services that are provided by forests, wetlands, meadows, and so on. Through some of our resiliency projects, we're doing restoration of wetlands and so on, which contribute again to watershed climate actions. And also we are doing our updated flood mapping and community and awareness and action. So there are many different projects, of course, that contribute to the overall picture. And many of these projects tie in with the presentation today, natural assets management. So moving to the Grindstone Creek Watershed. The watershed scale is key and critical to effectively studying and therefore understanding the natural assets, their services, their conditions, the risks of climate change to them, risks from other sources, and so on at the watershed scale. Simply put, flooding and various other things don't stop at political boundaries. And that's why the watershed scale is effective to better study and therefore provide management solutions. Conservation Halton is approximately 1,000 kilometers squared. We drain to Lake Ontario, so that's again the watershed basis. Now the Grindstone Creek Watershed, which is the focus of our project, it's just under 100 kilometers squared. It partially covers the cities of Burlington, Hamilton, and Halton region as well. So through the leadership of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative Group, or the MNAI, and partnering with the municipalities of Burlington, Hamilton, and also with the Royal Botanical Gardens and the Greenbelt Foundation, this project was put together. It is unique. It is one of the first of its kinds in Ontario, and it involves 4 main steps that you can see in the picture here, starting with an inventory of the natural assets, and then moving on to conditions and risk assessments, and then through modeling exercises, evaluating the services provided by the natural assets, whether that's stormwater management, water quality, climate resiliency, and so on. That leads to the 3rd step of economic valuation. This is not an easy concept, but it's been done before, and we've looked at that as well through the MNAI's leadership, is assigning a dollar value to those services that are provided by natural assets. And all of these steps lend themselves to incorporating natural assets into our different planning processes, including asset management. On this specific slide, we've put together a static image of an interactive dashboard that is developed by the MNAI and its consultants. This specific picture that you see is a static image of the natural asset inventory. This is a very large process. Lots of data pieces came together, as Roy described, through different organizations and agencies to put this one together. And it comprises of a few main pieces. So I'm just going to walk us through those. The MNAI started with a core natural asset inventory, and this is terrestrial based across the Grindstone Creek study area. Now what this includes is the forests, wetlands, ponds, successional and agricultural land covers. And then in the next step, we took a very deep dive into the watercourse based inventory. This follows the same conceptual approach as the step 1, but it applies to the watercourse features. This includes an inventory of the hydrologic network, where the stream reaches are defined as unique assets. And of course, the objective of developing this inventory was to capture the watercourse assets and create a basis for the overall asset inventory. And this includes considering the detailed monitoring data from Conservation Halton and the other partner organizations. And then there's the sub-watershed level inventory, where the natural asset is defined as a complete watershed, sub-watershed catchment. The catchment area is then characterized by pre-existing data, including the Conservation Halton watershed report card data. So we were able to use different existing pieces that are well established and widely used across Ontario, like the watershed report cards that are developed and implemented by conservation authorities. And also we looked at different things like the percent natural area and so on. So lots of pieces of information came together, led by MNAI, to put together this dashboard. Now the dashboard contains several other tabs, as you can see at the top of this picture. So I'm just going to walk us through a few other ones. This is digging one level deeper into the natural assets inventory. This specific picture shows the riparian asset details. And as you can see on this one, there's lots of different details here. We're looking at the agricultural, forest, wetlands, including the swamp and marsh riparian assets. And these are categorized by the different colors at the bottom left-hand corner. Now, chart 1, which is on the upper hand right side, looks at the different riparian zone assets by sub-watershed, and it provides the amount of hectares for each one within, for example, the sub-watershed within the Grindstone Creek Watershed for Clapison, Upper Hazeland, and so on. Chart 2 provides riparian assets by tree count and tree height. And then when you hover on each of those bars, it opens up further details that provides more detailed analysis. So for example, the natural asset inventory, or the NAI asset type forest, and the average tree height of about 15 meters. So this picture shows us another component of the interactive dashboard developed by MNAI. And this one is going into the natural asset conditions assessment. So in this case, the higher the score, the better the condition of the natural asset. And so from the picture, you can see that we've got, definitely some good areas denoted by the green, the lighter green and the darker green areas. But there are definitely some areas that we need to look at, areas perhaps for improvements that can be denoted by the darker tan or the red areas. And just to give you an idea of what goes into these conditions assessments, so for example, for the wetlands conditions assessment, we looked at the hydrological component of the Ontario Wetlands Evaluation System. Now, most, if not all of us, are very familiar with that. So again, we were able to utilize a resource that's widely established and widely used across Ontario, especially by conservation authorities. So the OS, or the Ontario Wetlands Evaluation System, provides a score for wetlands based on flood attenuation, water quality improvement, carbon sink, shoreline erosion control, and various other factors. The larger the score, the better the wetlands hydrologic condition is. And that was factored into the overall conditions assessment through this MNAI-led project. Another example I'm just going to provide is a linear road density. So of course, we're trying to look at the impacts from road salt application and so on. And this is looked at as the linear road kilometers per square kilometer area around the natural assets. So at the end of the day, that evaluation is characterized as low, medium, or high, with high denoting a higher level of road density, of course, and therefore impacting the condition of the natural asset. We also looked at the adjacent land use and assigned a scale of 0 to 100. And specifically, we looked at natural assets that intersect with development locations where they're classified as development areas. So there is a lot of detail that has gone into this, lots of technical and policy methodologies that are applied to the conditions assessment. Moving on to the risk assessment of natural assets. Here again, the higher the score, the higher the risk. And we've taken the widely established method of evaluating risks, which is considering the likelihood of an event happening and the impact of that on the natural asset. The types of risk that were analyzed in great detail through a partnership approach were pressures from development, loading from pollution, erosion, flooding, drought, sediment transport and changes in sediment transport, beaver dams, illegal dumping from excess soil or fill, and ice jams and ice cover. So again, the information in order to derive the risk score was obtained from all of the partners at the table, the municipalities, Conservation Halton, the Royal Botanical Garden, and various reports and studies that have been prepared in the past. So from this specific dashboard, you can see the risk score goes from 0 to close to 80. And as you can see, most of the scores are not looking too bad until you get closer to the shoreline. Here are some examples of digging deeper into the interactive dashboard. And so the mapping of these high-risk areas are shown here. So for example, the first of the 4 maps show you where the erosion risks are the highest through those blue areas. And again, most of them are closer to the shoreline. The road salt risk areas are characterized by those red lines that you see in the second map. And also we looked at the flood risk area. So higher in the upper reaches of the watershed. Another component under the Grindstone Creek Natural Assets Management Project was that we looked at the carbon sequestration and storage capabilities of the natural assets. So the M&AI group estimated these through a desktop exercise based on different publications that are available. One of them is shown here. So a publication by Green Analytics Consulting that was developed in 2020 was used to estimate the carbon sequestered by some of the Grindstone Creek natural assets. So again, carbon stored is the carbon that's bound in the woody material, both above and below ground. And the carbon sequestered is the removal of carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis processes. And usually these are calculated through an estimation of the removal of carbon dioxide. In the table that's shown on this slide, we have further converted that to the tons of carbon that are removed. And so with the asset class, for example, a forest, the tons of carbon removed per year are around 1,200. For wetlands, that's close to 1,000 tons of carbon removed per year by the wetlands within the Grindstone Creek watershed. So there's definitely something to be said for the economic, the valuation and the estimations of the actual carbon removed, and therefore climate resiliency services provided by our natural assets. These estimations then lend themselves to the economic valuation, so assigning a dollar value. And while we haven't presented those specific numbers in this report, we are close to finalizing them. Another aspect of the Grindstone Creek Natural Assets Project was modeling. So extensive modeling was conducted by consultants within the M&AI group. And what the modeling goal was to provide an idea of the stormwater management services that are provided by the watershed natural assets, including our wetlands and forests within the Grindstone Creek watershed. So of course, we looked at different scenarios. We looked at the services provided by the existing natural assets. In one of the scenarios, we removed those natural assets and just looked at bare earth and the difference. And then of course, we looked at scenarios of engineered assets added to the lands, adding low impact development to those lands, and then applying scenarios of climate change, so much higher amounts of precipitation based on projected modeled trends through climate data portals. So some of the preliminary results are showing that there is enhanced infiltration provided by forested areas. So our existing forested areas, when you apply climate change stresses to them through the climate change scenarios, there is enhanced infiltration services being provided by the forested areas. And what this means is flood attenuation. So flooding is definitely attenuated or mitigated by our forested areas, even through these stress climate change scenarios that are applied. There are also some potential benefits seen by stacking on the natural assets with low impact development features as well. So some of the next steps for Conservation Halton are to integrate the M&AI Grindstone Creek Watershed Project learnings, all of the knowledge that we've gained through this project, through this very collaborative project, into the Conservation Halton Watershed Climate Action Plan. Now we are just getting that started. The Watershed Climate Action Plan, as you can see in the few bullet points at the bottom of the slide, just wanted to kind of open that up and describe what that is. That is meant to understand the watershed conditions, risks, and trends through some of our existing reports and a few other extra analyses that we are undertaking, and then investigate those issues, whether they're current or future, with a climate change lens applied. And then, of course, at the end of the day, choose the best management solutions collaboratively with our municipalities. with the different organizations and stakeholders and partners at the watershed table. So some of our other next steps to take from the Grindstone Creek Natural Assets Project is to inform those watershed management options and solutions, apply the knowledge and the framework provided by MNAI across our other conservation Halton watersheds. And of course, also to integrate natural assets into the Conservation Halton asset management plan. So our natural assets and integrating those into a natural asset management plan will look at our dams, channels, our engineered channels, our reservoirs, and so on, that form our built and engineered asset management plan. So of course, like the municipality, as Roy described in detail, now we want to incorporate natural assets into those as well. Through this process, it's definitely laid out a really good roadmap and a blueprint to incorporate natural asset management into everything we do. And of course, conservation authorities bring a lot of that knowledge to the table. But with the MNAI project, that's opened it up even more and provided a few more rigorous methodologies to apply the knowledge. So I'm just going to wrap it up here from the Conservation Authority side of things too, are the other key benefits. And this is also something which is a strong message from all of us, the municipalities, the Conservation Authority, and also from MNAI as the lead in this project, is that the other key benefits include qualitative. We're not able to actually assign a value to these. And these are the Indigenous values and uses of natural assets, the health aspects, whether that's physical and mental health benefits provided by natural assets. And of course, the quantitative, where we're actually able to assign certain values and dollar values and so on, whether that's climate mitigation, stormwater, soil retention, and recreation and tourism. For a wrap up.
Whoops, there we go. So thank you very much, Chitra, and thank you very much, Cary. Also, I have to say, I just like to emphasize something that both Cary and Chitra have noted, which is that the work in the Grindstone Creek area is the work of many different players, and it is absolutely a collaboration and a partnership. It has been rolling out for a couple of years now, and very much feels like, and I believe is a team effort in which we all have our respective roles. I hope through this, these three presentations, you've got at least some sense of what we are trying to do in Grindstone Creek, and then hopefully also a sense that this is something that probably could and should be replicated nationally. I mean, and to put it in sort of a rhetorical way, as a local government in this country, why would you not want to understand what natural assets you own and rely on, and the services that they provide, and the potential risks and liabilities were these assets to become degraded? There is such a great opportunity here and such a strong imperative that we seize that opportunity. So really, the Grindstone Creek example is incredibly, in my view anyway, incredibly powerful in and of itself, and together with the work being done in other watersheds, for example, in the Credit Valley with CVCA and Region of Peel in British Columbia and the Comox Valley. These are examples that I hope we can replicate. And if we are also conscious of the sort of the overarching normative framework, it won't be done just by coalitions of the willing. It will be ultimately done because there are norms, standards, provincial and federal frameworks that really push and enable this work. So we will be wrapping up the Grindstone project. You'll see a final report in the not too distant future, but do bear in mind that natural asset management, it's not a sort of a finite A to B journey in which you reach a point where you say, oh good, everything is done. The implementation, the monitoring is all part of an adaptive management cycle that will continue infinitely, or for as long as the natural assets are present and healthy, which is hopefully infinitely. So thank you very much. We are around later and would be delighted to answer any questions. And I just wanted to again say a huge thank you to our partners in Burlington and conservation, Halton, and also of course Royal Botanical Gardens and the city of Hamilton and others. It's just been an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to support your work.
Thank you very much to Roy, Chitra, and Cary. It was a very interesting presentation. We have some good questions there that I would encourage everybody to kind of vote for those, to kind of get them up, and we'll review them at the Q&A session at the end of this next presentation that we're having. So again, thank you to our first presenters. It was very much appreciated and a great deal of good information provided. So with that, I would like to move on to the second presentation for this morning. In this presentation, we'll hear from Cameron Ogilvie. Cam is the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator at Soils at Guelph, a University of Guelph initiative to advance sustainable soil management in Ontario by bridging gaps between farmers, researchers, and the public. Cam has a Master's of Science in Cropping Systems and Agronomy from the University of Guelph, where he studied the impacts of cover crops. He prefers to call them service crops on water and nutrient cycling. He is an avid musician, an adventurer, and is passionate about helping different groups of people understand each other better. His presentation is entitled The Role of Healthy Soil in a Changing Climate. And following his presentation, we will invite all of our speakers to turn on their video and unmute themselves for Q&A. So thank you very much, Cam, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me and for attending this presentation. I want to send a specific thank you to Joanne Jodke, who linked me in with today, and so really happy to bring you some of the work that's happening at the University of Guelph right now. So my talk today is about the role of healthy soil in a changing climate, just looking at one of those slivers of natural assets, thinking specifically of agricultural land, as we look into a changing climate future and how we can better manage soil sustainably. Now, when we bring this question up about how do we better manage soil, it suggests that there's a problem. And so we are facing some challenges right now. From Ontario's soil strategy, it notes that 68% of Ontario farmland is estimated to be in an unsustainable erosion risk category. And in addition to that, 82% of Ontario farmland is losing more carbon than it is sequestering, and so contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. I was recently visiting a farmer in Harriston a couple of weeks back. And as I was driving to and from Harriston, my home here is in Guelph, this was the site that I saw on the side of the road. These two fields are 500 meters apart. And so what you see on the left is a field coming out of corn. It's being heavily tilled so that soil has been mixed up, that crop residue has been turned into the soil to try and encourage it to break down. And 500 meters away, there's another field where it's a completely different story. It's got a full, lush, green cover crop. That cover crop is covering the soil. The soil hasn't been disturbed. It's preventing erosion from taking place. It's got living roots in the ground, which are feeding soil microbes and so on and so on. So I think the question which often we ask when we see things like this is how do we get from there to there? And so I just want you to hold on to that question, and I'm going to come back to it at the end of my presentation. But if we're going to answer this question, I think first of all, we need to talk about soil. What is it? And so for those of you who might not be familiar with soil science, soil, you can really break it down into 4 simple categories. It's about half made up of gas and water. And then you've got a mineral chunk. That mineral chunk is made up of different sized particles that we break up into sand, silt, and clay. Sand being the largest particles, clay being the smallest ones. And those 3 particles, the proportions that they exist in, really determine your soil texture. So do you have a heavier soil, or do you have a lighter, sandier soil? And then finally, there's this one sliver what's called organic matter. And it's organic not because it's pesticide-free, GMO-free. It's organic because it's carbon-based, if you remember your organic chemistry from high school. So 58% of this organic matter fraction is carbon. And so when we start thinking about agriculture as a solution to climate change, and we start thinking about sequestering carbon in soil, this is where it ends up. It's in that fraction of organic matter that is carbon. And so sometimes you might even hear me in this presentation use organic matter and organic carbon interchangeably. Know that these 2 things are very much related. All right. There's a number of other things that exist in that organic matter. You can kind of think of it like a Kraft dinner box. You've got your carbohydrates, you got your your fibers and your proteins. And so there's a whole bunch of other things that exist in that organic matter as well. Now, in my title, I allude to this idea of soil health. And if you've maybe never heard of this term before, or maybe it's a little bit of a fuzzy idea, I'd like to encourage you to think of it in this way. How do you know if you are healthy? I think that's a little bit of a challenging question for us to answer. If you go to your doctors and you get a bunch of tests done on you, does your heart rate tell you if you're healthy? Does your weight tell you if you're healthy, or your body mass index, or your blood pressure? What tells you if you're healthy? Or maybe it's some collection of all of these things. Or maybe it's beyond some of these indicators. And I think this same principle applies to soil health. I think we know intuitively that we are healthy if we can continue to do the things that we love. If we can continue to get outside and go on a hike, or ride our bicycle, or spend time with family or friends, we know that we're healthy. And I think you can consider soil in much the same way. Soil health is defined as the continued capacity of a soil to function and providing ecosystem goods and services. This can be growing crops, it can be sequestering carbon, it can be filtering water, it can be preventing erosion, and so on and so forth. There's all these things that soil does. And it's vital to, as we just saw in the last presentation, these natural assets are vital to the sustainability of the ecosystem that we live in. Now, if we want to break this down a little bit more, I think one of the great parts about talking about soil health is that it's not just looking at any one of those indicators, and kind of the same way that you're not basing your health just off your blood pressure. You're looking at a whole picture. And so when it comes to soil, we really want to look at the biological aspects of the soil. So the living component of the soil, microbes and macroorganisms, earthworms, so on. What's going on in this biological side of the soil? In addition to what's happening in the physical side of soil and the chemical side of soil. So you get a soil fertility test, and that's going to tell you about some soil chemistry indicators. Those are indicators of soil health, but they won't give you the big picture. If you want to get the big picture, how healthy is soil, you got to look at all 3 of these areas. Now, how do we improve soil health? And maybe you've been hearing a term lately called regenerative agriculture. And I think when maybe people think about regenerative agriculture, they're thinking about either regenerating carbon that's in the soil building up that soil organic matter, or they're thinking about regenerating and improving soil health. And there's typically 5 principles or 5 practices that we think about when we're trying to improve soil. The first is minimizing the amount of disturbance that that soil experiences. This is primarily through tillage. The more you mix up that soil, the more you break up that structure, the more you end up deteriorating that soil health. Keep it covered. You can see this for the ecosystem services that soil provides. If we keep soil covered, we prevent soil erosion. We protect that soil structure from raindrop impact, which is not a small deal. A third is living roots. This is very much connected to keeping that soil covered. Having living roots in the ground 365 days of the year really keeps that soil in place, contributes to good soil structure. It's returning carbon and other things back to the microbes that are in the soil, and so feeding the soil biology, really good. Diversity, diversifying either in space, so having multiple different crops in the same space, polycultures, or diversifying over time. That's in a crop rotation, and so having diversity over time on the same soil. And then finally, incorporating animals, or if you don't have animals, incorporating animal manures. And so these are kind of the 5 principles we generally touch on. I want to just make one final comment before I'm going to dive into some research, and that is about the basics of soil carbon capture. So, as was mentioned by Chitra, plants take up carbon through the process of photosynthesis. So we've got carbon dioxide in the air, plants take that up, and through the process of photosynthesis, they convert that into sugars and fibers and all sorts of other compounds that allow the plant to grow. Some of that ends up in the roots. But a bunch of that carbon gets removed from the system when we harvest a crop. So it's important to think about the fact that when we have a full-grown crop, not all of that carbon is going to end up in the soil. Not all of it's going to end up in organic matter. A large chunk of that, probably 50%, is going to be removed through harvest. Furthermore, whatever organic material from that plant is left behind, a large chunk of the carbon that's in that material is going to be broken down and respired by soil microbes. So in the same way that we breathe out carbon dioxide, soil microbes, as they consume plant materials, they're going to release carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So at the end of the day, you've got a living crop that's growing, pulling down carbon out of the atmosphere, but only a small fraction of that is actually going to end up in the organic matter itself. And even that organic matter is going to be broken down over time by those soil microbes, and some of it will be released back to the atmosphere. And it's just a matter of time. So let's dive into some of the research. And I'm just focusing on some of the excellent work that's happening at the University of Guelph right now, work that I know closely and that I'm really passionate about. Crop rotation counts. This is part of that diversity story. And over the past year, we have been able to showcase over 65 years of crop rotation research that's happened at the Ridgetown Crops Research Center and the Elora Crops Research Center. An incredible project, and I encourage you to check it out on our website, soilsguelph.ca/crop rotation counts. When we diversify crop rotations over time, moving from a corn-soybean rotation, which is the most commonly grown crop rotation, crop alternation in Ontario, to a rotation that includes small cereal grains like wheat or oats or barley. Or if we include forage crops in that rotation, we improve soil health, and that increases corn and soybean yields, very profitable crops. It increases those yields within average years, but particularly in dry years, we see 2 to 5% yield increases in corn and 20 to 30% yield increases in soybean. And I am not aware of any other management practice that is going to help you beat the odds in dry years. This is really critical. Diversifying crop rotations is not just a climate mitigation strategy for sequestering carbon in soil. it is also a climate adaptation strategy. It's how we are going to adapt to a changing climate and be more resilient in the future. And this can be profitable. It depends on a lot of other factors and circumstances, but it can be profitable to include wheat in these rotations for the reasons that I've just mentioned: increased yield and increased yield resiliency. I've already alluded to this. These diversified rotations are helping to sequester carbon in soil as well. But it's not just about diversity. And so this is some of the work that's coming out of Claudia Wagner-Riddle's lab. And this is a publication by Allison King. There's a study summary on our website. That the highest soil carbon levels that we had in these long-term experiments were not necessarily under the most diverse treatments. They were under the rotations that had the longest amount of living roots in the soil over a year. So for example, at the Elora experiment, we have an alfalfa plot. So we've got 40 years of alfalfa on that field over and over. Hey, and that's a monoculture, but it's got a living root in the ground all year long. And that root is breaking down and turning over and being converted into organic matter and so on and so forth. And that's the thing with adding wheat into the rotation. You've got a living root in the soil, usually for the whole winter, because winter wheat is planted in the fall and it stays over to the next season. So we've got living roots that are in the soil more often. And so it's not necessarily about diversity for diversity's sake, but including crops in the rotation that are going to have a living root in the soil more of the year. Cary Dunfield is a soil microbiologist at the University of Guelph, and she's done some really interesting work on this experiment. If you've never seen a principal coordinate analysis plot, it is simply a diagram to show you how related two different crop rotations are in this case. So these are all the different crop rotations down on the right that exist in this experiment. And what we see on the left is how related they are to one another. The closer they are together, the more similar the microbial community is in those two experiments. The other part of this experiment is that it separates out based on tillage systems. So on the bottom left of that graph, those are all the tilled plots, and they have a very different microbial community than the plots which have not been tilled for 40 years. Now, here's another part of this. Have any of you heard the soil your undies test? You take a pair of cotton briefs, you bury them in the soil. These are George's. You can pick whatever you'd like, but they got to be cotton briefs. You bury them in the soil, you leave them for a couple months, and you come back and you see how the microbial community has broken those down. So here's what we found looking at these plots. There's a corn rotation. So not a rotation, for 40 years, we've been planting corn. That's what the underwear looks like after a couple months in the soil. You look at a corn-soybean rotation, it's not actually as broken down because there's not as much carbon that's going back into the system. There aren't as many living roots in that rotation. You look at a corn, soy, wheat rotation with a cover crop, and it's broken down even more. And finally, you look at that permanent alfalfa hay crop that has been there for 40 years, and there is barely anything left of these briefs. Here's that corn-soybean alternation, the most common crop rotation in Ontario under a tilled system where you've got tillage in the rotation. And are they wearable? I don't know. I'll let you make the judgment for yourself. But a really interesting example of how crop rotation, living roots, carbon in the soil is going to impact how active that microbial community is, how healthy that soil is. I talked about cover crops just then. Dr. Laura Van Aerd is a sustainable soil management researcher at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus and has a long-term cover crop trial at Ridgetown that's been going on since 2007, 2008. And what she has been able to show is that cover crops do help store carbon in the soil. They pull it out of the atmosphere, and by growing in that shoulder season after the main crop's been harvested, keeping the soil covered over the winter time, we are getting more carbon that is stored in the soil. The trick to this is that Laura has found, doing some economic work with Dr. Richard Vine, that cover crops tend to be more profitable in vegetable cropping systems. There's a number of reasons for that, but one of them is going to be the fact that in vegetable cropping systems, you've got a longer window of opportunity after the crop has been harvested to get your cover crop in the ground and get some good establishment and some good growth and really see the benefits of cover crops over the long term. So it's a key part of this. Claudia Wagner-Riddle is an agrometeorologist at the University of Guelph. And so she looks at the interactions between agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. And she has some large experiments at the Aurora Crops Research Center that are looking at carbon sequestration. And so here's one of them. This is unpublished work from one of her PhD students, Jacob Evans. And what you are looking at here is a graph of what's called net ecosystem exchange. You can think of it as a bank account of carbon in and carbon out, debits and credits. Okay, so as we go through the season, the x-axis is the day of the year. So as we go through the season, you start to see that line go up. And that is telling us that as the air starts to warm up, the soil starts to warm up, there is carbon that's being released. And that release is happening because the microbes are becoming more active. And they're starting to break down some of that organic material and so on. But then as the crop grows, and in this case, the crop is corn, that crop is going to start taking up carbon from the atmosphere. And then finally, you get to later in the season where that crop is harvested. And this doesn't show the carbon that's removed. This just shows you the amount of carbon that was taken up in this area where the crop was being grown. But keep in mind that there's a bunch of carbon that's removed and it actually comes out to about 0 at the end. Part of this experiment was also comparing having a cover crop after corn. And so you'll notice a slight difference between those two lines. The darker line has the cover crop, the lighter line doesn't have the cover crop. There's not a lot of time for that cover crop to establish. Here's soybean. Soybeans are a smaller plant than corn. There's that early carbon release and then some carbon capture by the soybean plant, but then it balances out at the end. Finally, if you compare a system that has small cereal grains and a cover crop in it to another soybean crop, a very profitable crop, again, that dark line is where we've got small cereal grains and a cover crop after it. So you see there's that initial buildup of carbon that's being released, and then it starts being taken up by the crop. The crop is harvested mid-season around that day 200. And then we've got our cover crop, which comes in afterwards and then starts taking up carbon once again. So this is how we use cover crops in those shoulder seasons where a crop wouldn't normally be grown to help take up carbon from the atmosphere, but provide another host of ecosystem services as well. I want to jump to the question of tillage because there's a lot of conversation about how tillage, yes, it breaks up soil structure. And the thought is that by breaking up that soil structure, by breaking up the soil aggregates, that you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And the complex answer to this is that it depends. So in Ontario, and I'm going to get into this data a little bit, it's complex. So some of the research from this long-term experiment shows that it's only in the surface layer that carbon is impacted. So when you till the soil, you're just putting carbon deeper into the soil because you're mixing it up. Whereas no-till, that carbon is concentrated right at the surface. So it's only for the surface layer is what this one study shows. Another study, which was published just last year, looks at much longer time than that, but a long time horizon of soil survey data in Ontario, and shows that, yes, soil carbon concentrations have declined over this past period, but the depth of the horizon that is being tilled has increased. So what's happening here is that the carbon is being diluted, and that's how the carbon concentration is decreasing, but it's not necessarily changing the carbon stock, the total amount of carbon in that soil. Now, down at Ridgetown, it might be a different story. There's a little bit of a different climate there. And so Laura Vineyard has shown that there is higher carbon storage under where systems aren't tilled compared to systems that are tilled. And she shows that down to over 1 meter. So this is this changes the story a little bit. But in summary, and this is work by Kate Congreves and others, soil texture, drainage class, a number of other factors are going to determine whether or not tillage does actually contribute to carbon release or carbon capture. There are other reasons that you would not till unrelated to soil carbon, but that's not what that question is asking there. Now, I've been talking a lot about carbon, and I was talking with Karen Ross, who is with Farmers for Climate Solutions, and I just love what she had to say here. We cannot get blinded by the potential of carbon sequestration. It is part of positioning farmers as part of Canada's climate solution, but nitrogen is the elephant in the room. We won't meaningfully reduce emissions if we don't improve nitrogen use efficiency. What's Karen getting at here? Well, part of the problem is that if you look at greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture across Canada, there's a different story in Western Canada than there is in Eastern Canada. In Eastern Canada, we've got a little bit of a wetter climate, and that is going to contribute to the formation of nitrous oxide more easily than in Western Canada. Because we also have a wetter climate, we are growing bigger crops, and those bigger crops demand nitrogen in order to grow to that size. So there's more nitrogen going into the system, and the likelihood that it's being converted into nitrous oxide also increases. If you look at all of these greenhouse gas emissions, and again, these are measured in CO2 equivalents, nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And so just a small amount of nitrogen lost in the form of nitrous oxide emissions does make a significant contribution to greenhouse gases. In fact, about 1/3 of agricultural emissions are from nitrous oxide. So we are storing carbon in the soil, and that's really important. But if we are going to address climate mitigation in agricultural systems, we have to consider that nitrogen portion as well. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through what's called 4R nutrient stewardship. Maybe you're familiar with this, but it's really thinking carefully and critically about how we use fertilizers in our systems. And I'm just going to talk in this case about nitrogen. Using the right source, the right rate, putting it on at the right time, and putting it in the right place so that it can be used effectively by the crop, and minimizing losses to the environment. The good news story with this is that crop rotation can help us better manage nitrogen in our cropping systems and on our agricultural lands. By including small cereal grains, forage crops, and leguminous cover crops in crop rotations, we're able to increase the amount of available soil nitrogen that's in the soil. And because of that, we can decrease the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that we need to use over time without affecting crop yields. So this is going to be a key part of helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from nitrogen. Some other work that has come from Claudia's lab and Cary's lab looks at nitrification and urease inhibitors. So these are microbial inhibitors that are applied to the fertilizer before it's put in the field. And what they have been able to find is that it reduces the activity of those microbes, which are taking that free nitrogen and converting it into nitrous oxide, by about 50%. This is huge. And the really important part about this is that it's not long lasting. And so this isn't going to affect the microbial community over the long term. They do rebound afterwards. But it allows us to make sure that that nitrogen is being released in the proper time for the crop demand, and that's not being lost into the environment. Another key part of this is using split nitrogen applications. So think about it as, instead of putting all of your nitrogen up front and banking on it, that it's going to get to the crop when it needs it, you put a little bit up front, and then you provide a smaller dose to the crop later in the season, depending on the year. And so this is a key part of this strategy, is that by delaying it, by delaying the full application and saving a little bit till later, you can decide, is this a year where there's a lot of moisture, a lot of heat, and so we're going to have a big crop and we need that nitrogen? Or is this being a drier year, a cooler year, and we're just not going to have that same growth and we don't need to apply as much? And so what this study from Caballero et al. Showed is that by making that decision, by splitting that nitrogen application and being able to decide whether or not you're going to apply more later on, we're able to reduce nitrate leaching, reduce nitrous oxide emissions, and reduce ammonia volatilization. So really key part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it's not simple. This does add complexity into a farm operation. But what they were also able to show is that this, while it adds complexity, it can be profitable. And that profitability is particularly during dry seasons, where a farmer is not having to put on that extra nitrogen where they don't need it. And so that you can save on costs there, and it's a benefit to the environment. It's a win-win. Overall, nitrous oxide emissions could be reduced by as much as 50% by combining these 4R practices. And this is some more modeling work that came out of Claudia Wagner-Riddle's lab. So some really neat work here showing lots of potential to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture by using practices which improve soil health and are climate smart, climate friendly. So I bring it back to this picture here, asking this question: how do we get from this situation, lots of tillage, lots of disturbance, prone to erosion, so on and so forth, and how do we get to this cover crop, this system where there's a crop that's covering the soil, there's living roots in the ground, the microbes are being fed, there's nitrogen going back into that system from the crop, and so we're able over the long term reduce our fertilizer inputs. We've likely got small grains in this rotation. How do we transition this? So here's some sociology research, economics research at the University of Guelph. This is the reality. Farmers are almost 10% less likely to plant cover crops on land that they rent compared to they own. There are other factors external to whether or not this is good for the soil and good for the environment. There are other factors that are going to affect the management decisions that farmers make. And so if you don't have tenure security, that is going to reduce the likelihood that you are going to make a long-term investment in the health of that soil. So this is challenging. It's not always the case. In fact, just recently, an Ontario cover crop report came out. It's published by the Grain Farmers of Ontario. Great work by Callum Morrison and Yvonne Lawley. And interestingly, they do not see this same effect that tenure security determines whether or not cover crops are planted. So it can be a factor, but it's not always. Here's some other work by Paige Allen, a former graduate student at the University of Guelph in capacity development and extension. She interviewed a cohort of farmers, some who had planted cover crops and some who had not. And the interesting thing she found is that those who did plant cover crops had a more extensive personal network. They were involved in a greater number of farm organizations. They were more active in those organizations. And 72% of the people she interviewed were involved in more than 2 community organizations. This is connection. The farmers who were planting cover crops were far more connected. They had a better social network than those who were not. Cover crop adoption decisions are complex. There's matters of identity, there's value systems, there's trust, risk factors, and a person's tendency to be risk avoidant. All of these things factor into whether or not farmers are going to make a decision to adopt a practice which is complex and new and unfamiliar. So how do we get from here to here over those barriers? And I want to suggest as I wrap up today that maybe this is the wrong question. Maybe it's not about a linear path from one system to another, but maybe it's an adaptive path. Maybe it's a bit of a circular path. Maybe it's about adaptation and not adoption. Maybe it's not about cookie cutter solutions that work for everyone. Maybe it is more about sharing. Maybe it's more about building connections between researchers and farmers and industry and government and others. I think what research brings to the table is confidence. It reduces risk, the likelihood that you are going to venture out into a new practice and it's going to backfire on you. Farmers already have enough complicated decisions that they have to make. Research helps to validate decision-making. And so what are the strategies to improve soil health that have a scientific support behind them and that are economically profitable? And I think that's what research brings to the table. But we're not the only ones in that conversation. This is why Soils Like Wealth exists, to advance sustainable soil management in Ontario by making research accessible, but facilitating knowledge exchange between researchers, farmers, industry, government, and the general public. And that knowledge exchange, I believe, is critical to whether or not we are going to see changes in how we are managing healthy soils in the face of a changing climate. Some of what we are doing is helping to develop resources that take the research that we're working on and package it in accessible forms. So we've got study summaries on our website. We've been working on those infographics, which I've shown throughout, on crop rotation counts. We've got some cover crop recipes, which we've been working on with Anne Verhollen, who I saw was on the call earlier. And these are great starter kits for those who are new to cover crops. Just where do you begin? And these are great little 2-page fact sheets to work on that. And we've got a great video that we've just released on cooking with covers. It's a funny, cheesy little mini series that we've been working on for growers who might be new to it, but interested, and some key messages. Keep it simple is the first one, and I'm not going to let the other ones go just yet, but we've got 2 more that are that'll be coming out shortly. As I mentioned, we are not the only ones involved in this space. There are a number of others who are doing this important work of building connections between farmers, researchers, government, industry, and the public. And one of them is the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association through this on-farm program. So a large cooperator site network across the province looking at water quality impacts, soil health impacts, and focusing on engagement. I am really pleased to be part of the stakeholder engagement working group for this project. And I think this is a great way to help encourage knowledge sharing, collaboration among these groups, exchange of ideas. And as I mentioned, there are many others, and there are people who are missing from this slide, but I threw it together and it's just a bunch of names that we've been working with over the past little while. And really, we are all coming under this banner that up in the left-hand corner, you'll see it, Soil for Life. Like, soil is the foundation of civilizations. It's the foundation of our food systems, our ecosystems. We need to care for soil because the soil cares for us. It's our life. And so we're really trying to come together under that banner, under that movement, and try to build collaboration and knowledge sharing moving into the future. I love this quote from Paul Harvey. It's humbling. Despite all our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And so I think this is all the reason why we need to be working together, not linearly, not in a cookie cutter way, but working together as peers to help address these challenges that are facing healthy soils in a changing climate. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that's going to come afterwards.
Thank you, Cam. That was an insightful presentation. Again, a lot to think about, some really great information there. So thanks very much for that. I appreciate it. The information in both presentations highlights the benefit of natural-based solutions, and I'm happy to see that we've got a number of questions that have been coming up through the Q&A session for the speakers. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their presentations, very much appreciated. And at this time, I'd like to ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras. to have a bit of a discussion and give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions. We'll be going from those Q&As to get things started. And again, just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please enter it into that Q&A box accessible at the bottom of the panel. And if you'd like to question something specifically, please let us know. So with that, I think I have all the speakers there. So I think what I will do is I'll go with the first question that we have, and I'll put it out. It's not to specifically anybody, but are there any future climate scenarios being incorporated into infrastructure designs, including natural assets? So perhaps Chitra and your team, you could speak to that.
Sure, yeah, so I'm unable to bring my video on. If there's, there we go. Okay, just got the alert. Thank you so much. All right. So I certainly cannot speak to the municipal perspective, but one thing that we've learned through the process here is that we do need to consider climate change scenarios, and that will certainly be one of our future goals, and definitely in the near future, especially with respect to Conservation Authority asset management plans. But for the municipal perspective, I'd like to hand that over to Cary, and then we can ask him if that's a consideration from the municipal perspective.
Cary, can you answer that, provide some insight? Okay, I'm just going to perhaps...
I can offer a thought if he's struggling with his camera.
Roy, that would be great. Thank you.
I was going to say that so in all of the natural assets management work that M&AI does, in the assessment phase, we would model out the current capacity of natural assets to provide a suite of services, and then in a what's called the planning phase, we are modeling out future scenarios, and inevitably local governments, we find, want to understand what natural assets and sometimes their engineered comparators will do in a changing climate. And that's a really kind of neat part of the work, is that you can plan out and model out if-then types of scenarios, as Cary and Chitra were stating. So what happens if I double riparian buffers? What happens if I restore this, or if that becomes degraded? And we can also factor in, as a function of the climate change information that is available, different future climate scenarios, such as a 1 in 100 year, 50-year storm event. And that's an example of what we did in the Riverview situation that I mentioned earlier. One thing that's quite interesting that we see is natural assets, that they typically have a certain sort of resilience or plasticity. And this means that in many cases, they can provide the same level of services, still provide the required level of services way out into the future. And this means in turn that their value increases over time. By comparison, a lot of engineered assets, I mean, your pipe's not going to get any bigger because it's rainy outside. They are engineered to do one thing. They will not adapt or change. So you do see the certain sort of versatility to natural assets, and actually the work led by the CVCA, Credit Valley Conservation Authority, and region of Peel, with support from M&AI back a few years ago, I think illustrates that that particular thing very nicely, as do a few others.
Great, thank you very much, Roy. I appreciate that. I'll just move on to another question. This one's directed to Cameron. Since the alfalfa on the non-rotation crop demonstrated the healthiest soil, can permanent rotational pasture of animal agriculture be a profitable alternative to farmers who normally grow cultivated crops?
Yeah, so it's a complex question, but I believe the answer is yes, because there are farmers who do it. Now, there's a number of reasons why you might not want to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and why you might want to diversify your operation and not just be in permanent pasture and livestock. But there are farmers who do that and who are profitable at it.
Okay. Again, another question here is, and this is directed to you, Cam, is that has anyone looked at the impacts of silviculture and whoops, bear with me, silviculture, the forest crops on soil carbon? Do you have healthier forest soil if the silviculture has mimic natural succession than if you replace the crop harvested at the same time? For example, if the boreal, in the boreal, a progression from trembling aspen to a mixed wood to a conifer crop to black spruce instead of replacing black spruce with black spruce. So I think really the gist of that question is, if I may, is that have you looked at that that aspect from the impacts of silviculture and forest crop on soil carbon?
So that's not my area of specialty. If you wanted to follow up with a researcher in particular, Naresh Tavathasan would be the ideal person to speak to, who's working in agroforestry systems. I think just a general principle is, again, what is your goal? And so if your goal is increasing carbon storage, let's say, the native species to a particular region aren't necessarily going to lead to the greatest carbon storage. It's more complex than that. There might be a number of other reasons to have native species part of the regular succession in that area. But so it depends what purpose you're trying to come at it with. And so I'd really encourage you to follow up with Naresh, and he can likely give you some more feedback on that. I'd be happy to pop his email in the chat as well.
Great, thank you, Cam. This is a question that I have just kind of coming out of things, and it's really directed to the first group, and perhaps Chitra, you may want to take a stab at it, but it's open to all three. I noticed at the end of your presentation you had some information as to next steps and implementation. I'm just wondering, what do you envision the implementation being with this? Is it through the land use planning process? Is it through infrastructure and capital development for the municipalities? How does a document such as this, what you are working on, how does that get implemented at the municipal and conservation authority level?
I can take a first stab at that, Scott. That's a really interesting question, and we certainly would like to move forward with the learnings and the knowledge gained from this very collaborative process. From Conservation Halton's perspective, this will be incorporated into the watershed management planning process. And what we've learned here, of course, is applying that climate change lens is critical. The way that MNAI set it up was to include modeling to incorporate the climate change lens with the different scenarios, including climate change scenarios. And we found that exercise to be valuable. And we'd like to take that forward into the watershed planning process and include that in our watershed climate action plan. From an asset management perspective as well, yes, with our asset management plan, we're looking at our dams, our engineered channels, our reservoirs, and so on. Even there, similar to the municipality, we want to incorporate the natural assets into that planning process, which has not happened, not in the sense of the way that the MNAI has set it up, of course. And so we would like to incorporate that in our next iteration. And that will not be too far off in the future. We're talking about a span of somewhat 3 to 5 years span, if you will. I'll hand it over to Cary.
Yeah, thanks, Chitra. As I mentioned in my presentation, the asset management plan for the city is the key driver for inclusion of the natural assets. We also have our development approval process where that could be used for implementation in the future, and also financially, if we decide to venture into the development charges realm with respect to natural assets.
I could add some observations more broadly if you wish, Scott.
Sure, by all means.
So I'd say maybe 3 or 4 things. First, the implementation side of things is typically pretty highly contextual, but that said, there's going to be, in most cases, opportunity at a very high kind of strategic level to embed consideration of natural asset management into strategies, plans, then into land use planning, zoning, below that into asset management plans and the operations and maintenance plans that support that, sometimes into human resources. In some cases, it'll lead to restoration work. In others, it'll lead to just leaving well enough alone and letting nature do its job. A point that's worth emphasizing is that in all cases, these decisions and these plans, they're already sort of grinding ahead. And in many cases, with only very partial consideration or understanding of the role of natural assets. Another important piece, and we should have some work out on this within 2 to 3 weeks, is around this very challenging area of levels of service. So basically linking local governments' kind of high-level plans and expectations related to the more sort of granular asset management and operational level planning. So we can link up the granular work with the high level planning through an understanding of service levels of service, which you could understand as basically performance indicators.
Great, thank you very much, Roy. Appreciate that that information from the 3 presenters there. Just moving on to our next question, it's a little bit of a lengthy one, but it just says, in the United States, FEMA provides flood maps and leadership on flood management. You can look at these maps up, and they end at the Canadian border in Abbotsford. How should floodplain protection laws change in Canada, and which role should the federal government play? So that's a pretty broad question, I think. I know there's a lot of work going on that. And within Ontario, certainly conservation authorities work on floodplain mapping, but just turn it over to the panelists if there's anybody that wants to take a stab at an answer for that.
Sure, Scott, I can try to take a stab at that, but you're right that it's a very broad question, one that we're all still working on. So just in terms of some preliminary discussion there, that's, I shouldn't say preliminary, long-standing discussions, is the role of the federal government. They remain to be at that higher level. Certainly at the local level, it's the conservation authorities in partnership with other agencies, especially including municipalities, that know the lay of the land. We understand where the pressures are, whether they're climate change or different factors, including development and so on. You know, when we look at where flooding is happening and where it might happen in the future, given climate change, the federal government remains to be more higher level and overarching. Certainly there can be stronger legislation, but what that will look like is to be determined, simply because that local need and knowledge is so critical to making things make sense on the ground for our communities. In many different ways. So the newly proposed Canada Water Agency could be that vehicle to provide more stronger overarching framework. Maybe those are technical framework. Maybe they will show us how to incorporate climate change across the board consistently across Canada. But do we want that overarching approach to define what we do? I think we can all agree to know. The local processes and lay of the land remain to be important.
Great. Thanks, Chitra. I appreciate that answer for sure. This the next question I'll just move on to, and this is really directed at Cam. Was there an age component to farmers who use cover crops or not?
Yes. So I believe in the studies that I mentioned, specifically Deaton and Paige Allen's thesis work. I don't recall there being one. I understand that the data is mixed, and I would just say, being connected with the Ontario Soil Network. Now, this is an exceptional group of folks, but being connected with the Ontario Soil Network, there are certainly some folks in that network who have been doing it for years. And in fact, I'm thinking now of the new Ontario cover crops survey that has gone out, and there are people who have been using cover crops for a significant amount of time that show up in that survey. So I think it does depend.
Okay, no, thank you. Appreciate that. And again, I have a question for you. Again, I think it's to you specifically, Cameron, but maybe all the panelists can provide a response. But how are sustainable soil management practices both good for the soil, the farm business, and the aquatic ecosystems?
Mm-hmm. So I think some of what I've shown sustainable soil management practices, really, I'm just going to go back to those 5 regenerative practices of keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance, keep living roots in the ground, diversify, and incorporate animals into the system somehow. I think those are good for the soil because they're going to increase the amount of carbon that's cycling in the soil. That's going to feed soil biology. It's going to improve soil structure. The benefits for the soil go on and on. When you think about how those benefits provide soil functions, which contribute to ecosystem services, reducing the amount of disturbance that happens in the soil prevents soil erosion where loss of topsoil comes into water bodies that ends up bringing nutrients along with it, and those nutrients are going to contribute to eutrophication events. And how is it relevant to the farm businesses? Well, in some of these cases, soil is one of a farmer's most precious assets. And so if you are losing or degrading part of your asset, long-term, you are going to see the effects of that. And that is going to shake out in the bank account. So it's the benefits aren't necessarily seen immediately. From the cover crop survey, it's interesting to see that some of the benefits can be seen within a year or 2 to 3 years. And so it is a little bit longer term thinking, but that longer term thinking does pay off in the long run.
That's great. Thank you. And I think we're kind of getting to the end of the question period, but the one question that came up in the first presentation that I think I'd like to give the panel a chance to answer is, it's really a statement, but I think there was a follow-up question as well. But specifically, it's the question statement is, it's interesting that beaver dams were considered as a risk as part of your work on that program. So again, the first group of panelists for the presentation, any thoughts on why beaver dams were considered as a risk?
Scott, so that's definitely a good question there, and it was very specific to one area only. And as Cary's also provided some context there, there is an issue with respect to access to the community being only one road, access to that community being able to go in and out, and it's highly flood prone due to various reasons there. So in that one instance, yes, the beaver dams were a risk with respect to flooding and erosion, but I can hand it over to Cary to elaborate.
Yeah, thanks, Chitra. Exactly as you mentioned it, this particular area is a one-way in, one-way out access, and Grindstone Creek is right alongside the access road. And we have had situations in the past where there have been not just beaver dams, but ice jams and things like that, which lead to flooding and potentially actually blocking the roadway. So from that point of view, there's a risk to actual access into the people's homes, but also potential for damage to private properties, homes, buildings, and infrastructure. So that was the approach that was taken, and the assessment that was decided on for that specific location.
Great, thank you, Cary. I appreciate that. The beaver issue is certainly something we deal with in the HCA's watershed as well, and it's perhaps a little bit of a love-hate relationship sometimes as far as that goes. So thanks for your answer. Cameron, you have indicated you have a question that you'd like to ask Chitra, so perhaps I'll just turn it over to you to ask Chitra directly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, Chitra, I was, of course, I'm biased. And so when I was looking at your natural asset management dashboard there, I was looking at that large chunk of that large percentage of land, which was agricultural, that large asset, which was agricultural. And I loved how you broke that down into, you know, how are these affecting streams and things like that. But would just kind of love to hear, since I'm biased, would love to hear a little bit about, yeah, how does that agricultural asset factor into some of the work that you're doing on natural asset management?
Sure, Cameron. It's definitely a work in progress. I will be honest about that. The concept of agricultural lands lending themselves to climate resiliency is not new, but it's certainly emerging in terms of us better understanding and, more importantly, better appreciating the value that is being brought by it. Certainly in the high growth and high development areas where there could be loss in agricultural lands, we definitely want to better quantify and understand what that means in terms of climate resiliency. So Cameron, I don't have a definitive answer to your question, except that I can say that appreciate the kinds of science that people like you bring to the table, because that is helping us define things more broadly as we move along and better appreciate the value that agricultural lands bring to it and better quantify it. So we definitely need the kind of work that you're conducting, the value from soils and all that. Again, not new, but certainly need to be better quantified and brought into the natural asset management process.
Can I add something to that?
Sure,
Yeah.
right.
I was going to say, so in the work that we do across Canada, I mean, everyone is downstream of somebody else, and no local government that we have yet come across is relying on services from natural assets that the local government owns in their entirety. In most cases, local governments are benefiting from natural assets that are under the ownership and jurisdiction of others. And just, which is why a watershed approach is so important. In some places like the city of Charlottetown, they're almost entirely surrounded by agricultural land that's privately held. So it means if you're trying to do natural asset management and you're not thinking about agricultural land, you're not going to get a useful result. And as Chitra said, I think the work is, from our point of view anyway, still in its infancy, but it's a vital area, one where a whole lot more work needs to be done. I'd also say that, look, I mean, in Ontario, you're fortunate in that you have conservation authorities, but no one else has those. And in many places where local governments are trying to provide services from multi-use, multi-stakeholder, multi-jurisdiction watershed without any kind of overarching or coordinating power, ability, legislation, anything. And, you know, back to the comment about federal roles, I think that's an important one. On a completely tangential point, I don't know if we've mentioned in this presentation, but the Greenbelt Foundation has been very important in this. I forget if Cary and Chitra noted this, they may well have, but if not, just wanted to underscore that.
Scott, you're muted.
Yep, sorry. Thank you. I think we're going to tie it up here, but I have one question, and I think all panelists might want to take a stab at it, but because I think both presentations relate to it. But have you looked or considered the selling of carbon offsets as part of the your overall work and how we can use that as a benefit.
I can.
So Roy, go ahead, by all means.
I mean, it's obviously a large, a substantial topic. I think it's something that we would want to approach extremely carefully. I think there's some good evidence out there. The Royal Society put out a paper quite recently, the British Royal Society, saying that, look, if you try and sort of dumb down ecosystem management just to sort of amplify the carbon storage benefits and to get carbon credits, you can really find yourself deep in the land of perverse consequences and unintended outcomes. So, yes, it's a topic, and yes, it's something that needs to be carefully thought through. And as Chitra laid out, carbon storage, carbon sequestration are very clearly going to be co-benefits of any natural asset management work that you're going to do. But actually moving from there into carbon credits, I think it's something that needs to be done very carefully so that we don't have a backfire on us.
Great. Any other comments there?
Yeah, I would chime in on that too. I think Roy's absolutely right that we really do not want to see this backfire. I know farmers are very, very interested in it. And I think some of the data that I've shown in my presentation today shows how it certainly can be a benefit provided by agriculture. However, it is complex. As I was mentioning, stocks don't necessarily relate to concentrations. And if this is going to be effective, we need it to be data driven, and it needs to be validated. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. So lots of work still to be done.
Okay, I think that's great. And I see we have one last question, but Cameron is answering that directly by typing the answer in. So I think we'll wrap up the Q&A session at this point in time. I'd like to thank everyone for that excellent discussion. We hope that the session today has given you some ideas regarding natural-based solutions for changing climate change, for addressing climate change, and that you can use this information in your program activities. We're now at the end of our session. Once again, the session has been brought to you by the Latornell Steering Committee. I'd like to thank all of those who helped make this happen, including Jan Ivey from Credit Valley Conservation, Jane Lewington from Conservation Ontario, Elizabeth Van Horen from the Kettle Creek Conservation, Bill Trenuth from ACOM, Mario Mallet and Karen Anderson from Allset Inc. As we reimagine our future of our conference, we hope you enjoyed this opportunity to keep in touch. One more thing just before you leave, please complete our last poll on the screen telling us how informative you felt this webinar was to help us plan for future sessions. There's 4 questions there all together. And that a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch. Please give us a few days to get that posted. And don't forget to check out the library of recordings from our other sessions from 2020 and 2021. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about nature-based solutions for a changing climate. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you and goodbye.